listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to the September 3rd edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Let's find out about today's guest, Dr. Daniel Silliman.
Today on Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Our guest, Dr. Daniel Silliman, is the news editor for Christianity Today magazine. He earned a doctorate in American Studies at Heidelberg University in Germany and has taught at Heidelberg, Notre Dame, Valparaiso, and Milligan universities. In August of 2024, he released his newest book, One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation from the presidency. Nixon is a complicated historical figure who wrestled with God for most of his life. Today's episode will help us discover if he was eventually able to find what he was looking for. Here is Daniel Silliman and your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
Dr. Silliman, I'm very pleased to have you here today. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So with my first question today, I'm going to admit that it's much more meandering than the questions I usually ask, but I will eventually get to the question, get to the point.
Okay.
So I'm curious about your name, your last name. So when I was preparing for the interview, I found a man named Daniel Silliman who was born in Connecticut in the 17th century, and his wife's name was Truthful. That was her first name. So that sort of was a hint to me that they were probably Puritans. So Silliman is not a common name, I'm guessing. So I'm guessing that there must be some connection. And then the Puritans and Quakers have similar roots. And our topic today, Richard Nixon, was a Quaker. And then that leads me to the question. Was there any intentional overlap between your family history and Nixon's religious roots that inspired you to write this book?
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, but not in the way that you're suggesting with the question. The Silliman is a unusual name. It's a small family. I think there's something like 700 of them total in the world. They originally come, as I understand, from family members' genealogical research. They originally come from Italy, but they were Protestant and changed their name while going to Switzerland to sort of seem more German and blend in a little bit better, even though they weren't German, and there are no Germans named Silliman. And then came to the U.S. in the early days, and there was a professor who I believe did chemistry, who was quite, maybe geology, who was quite prominent. And there was also a Civil War or a Revolutionary War general named Silliman. I'm pretty distantly related to them, even though I have, in that one case, the identical name. My great-grandfather was adopted, so I'm actually Irish. Just got pulled into the family, which is apparently a thing that happens sometimes. But I did have some connection to Richard Nixon, and specifically this question of his spirituality. He grew up in Southern California in a devout religious family and worked for his dad, which I talk about in the book being pretty traumatic and integrating his work and life and faith in ways that stuck with him, not always positively. I also grew up in California. So actually I haven't lived there in a while. So when I went to the Nixon library and did the research, I had this sense of like, oh, wait, I remember what it was like to be a kid in this, the weather smelled like this. You know, it had that kind of tactile memory section. I also worked for my dad and also grew up in a religious family and had a kind of intense religious childhood. My family were Jesus people, and so we sort of grew up waiting for the apocalypse, and religion was kind of fearful as I experienced it, which isn't identical to Nixon's, but there were enough similarities that I started from a place of identification.
Okay. So, as we heard in the introduction, we're going to be discussing Dr. Silliman's book today called One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation. So, in many ways, to me, Nixon seems like one great dichotomy. He was a Quaker, which is a pacifist tradition. Then he, as president, had to bomb some countries during the war. Yeah. He never quite accepted religion, but he held church services at the White House. And then he seemed to love his own children, but not children in general. So what made Nixon tick?
I think at his core, there is a religious struggle happening. And I think he's not religious in the normal sense of being pious, or he just loves going to church or something like that. He's not someone who finds swearing offensive, as all America learns when the secret tapes come out and they're full of him cursing up a storm. But he is religious in the sense of having this kind of struggle with God, this struggle to feel accepted and to feel worthy of love, and I think as a Christian myself, and I think the way that's clear is to talk about this as a struggle to receive or accept grace. Protestantism, including Quakerism, has so often centered on this as the core doctrine, right? Jesus loves you, and you don't have to earn it, you have to accept it. You don't have to save yourself, you have to trust what Jesus has done for you. And that doctrine teaches you something about your innate value, and teaches you to rest in God's love. And hopefully each of us also experience that rest in our parents' love, and that rest in just our sense of the universe, that our very existence is good and beloved and rewarding, and obviously we do bad things, but there's a sort of core goodness to us. I think that Nixon didn't quite get that from his religious childhood, in part because of his parents' own trauma, his parents' own aggression. His father was a violent man who always told him he didn't work hard enough. His mother withheld emotion. Nixon said she never said that she loved him. She thought all emotional affection was sloppy, even with your kids. And he also got a specific religious teaching, which is not that uncommon, which is, hey, you need to shape up. You need to be good. God set down these rules, and you need to work harder. And sometimes I think we hear that message after grace. God loves you, and therefore go and be good, and therefore go serve the Lord and love your neighbors. And other times we hear it as oh, God's angry at me and I need to work harder. And that's definitely how Nixon got it. So he had this incredible drive and incredible work ethic, but also this incredible aching need to prove himself and to win approval from somebody somewhere. I think for a large chunk of his life, it's trying to win the approval of the voters. And I think that's what's driving him, and that's what's kind of the starting place for a lot of those apparent contradictions that you're talking about.
Okay, and this is a question from based on what you just said, a little bit of a different angle. So it's clear from your book that Nixon never felt love or acceptance. But do you think his misdeeds could have been his way of rejecting the acceptance he finally achieved through the electoral process because he just didn't feel worthy of it?
Maybe. I do think there there are clear moments in his life where he succeeds and kind of can't handle it. And that's interesting. That's a kind of telltale sign, I think, when that you don't feel love and you don't accept grace. When something good happens to you and you in your own head, like, it's not enough. It's never enough. So when he wins he loses quite dramatically in 1960 and then runs for governor and loses again and has this huge outburst. It's pretty humiliating for him. But then he runs for president and wins by a lot in 1968 and runs again in 72 and again wins by a massive amount. And it's not enough. And he becomes this kind of open sore of need and is like calling people and seeking reaffirmation. The other real moment that I see that is after he goes to China, which is this amazing accomplishment that not only took a lot of work, but it was also something that was almost unfathomable to reconnect the United States and communist China and open up diplomatic relationship and shift the entire Cold War. We forget now, but like the relationship between China and Russia shifted dramatically because of this one visit. It was a huge deal and maybe Nixon's greatest accomplishment. And on the way home, he could not be consoled. It wasn't enough for him, and he didn't feel good and couldn't sit with that, when you finish a good project and a big project, there should be at least a moment where you're like, I did it. I did what I wanted to do. And yeah, satisfaction. And instead he was just like calling his assistants up in the middle of the night and being like, did we do it? Was it successful? Was it enough?
Wow.
Like, tell me how good it was again, and sort of needing reassurance after reassurance after reassurance. But I'm not quite sure. Your question went more in the direction of like, was there kind of a self-sabotage?
Yes.
I didn't really see evidence for that. I think what it wasn't I need to defeat myself. It was more I'm so paranoid about other people. There's a lot of projection. Like, other people are being bad, so I'm going to have to be bad preemptively or reactively. Even though I don't actually know that other people are being bad, I got to match them with my own ill deeds.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so the other day I was watching this video. It was an old interview with Charlie Rose, and he was interviewing Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And in the video, Mr. Rogers talked about a parent's expression of love being the most important gift you can give to your child. Do you think Nixon could have used an advisor like Mr. Rogers?
Like in the White House?
Yes.
Oh, that would be amazing. I don't know what would have happened. By that point in his life, he had trouble letting people in. And even when people around him, were convinced that he was good and deserved love and praised him all the time, like he had something where he had trouble hearing it. So yeah, I would have loved to insert Mr. Rogers into Richard Nixon's life, but ideally it would have happened earlier, right? There's a reason that Mr. Rogers did children's television and not advising presidents. There's I think an unfortunate point in your life where you're kind of set, and it's becomes quite hard to have that change. But I have this sort of quote that kind of blew my mind and crystallized the idea for the book from Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's national security advisor and himself survived the Holocaust and then became a political expert in America, an expert in realpolitik. And he had one of these encounters with Richard Nixon, and he sort of sat back and said, "My God, what a man, what this man could have been if only somebody had loved him." And that really brought it into focus for me. Like, yeah, that's the religious struggle. But of course, people did love him. His daughters loved him. I don't know that his parents could express it, but I don't have any reason to think that they didn't love him. And there were people around him, people chanted his name, people put his bumper stickers on their car, and he had people who worked for him who believed in it, what he was doing so much, they were willing to break the law at quite a significant personal cost. That's not love. I mean, maybe it's not the best form of love, but like they believed in him and they were affirming him. And yet the evidence of his own writings and all the stuff I found in the archives was sort of, he didn't quite believe it when it did happen. He didn't quite accept it. He thought his kids loved him because he thought his kids respected him because he had done great things, where like, that's not really how the kids are not as impressed with your job as you think they should be, right? They want you to play catch or whatever the equivalent is. He thought the men working around him didn't really see him, but just kind of believed in the principles that he happened to embody. So I think if you had imagined Richard Nixon like with a vice president, Mr. Rogers or something like that, I don't know if he could have accepted it. I don't know. He needed a kind of change in his heart, a change in his soul, a kind of a religious experience where he could have believed Mr. Rogers. And I don't know. I need that too sometimes. I see that need a lot. Where like it's not just that no one loves you; it's that you need to believe it, that God so loved the world. You need to let that truth in.
So, who was his idea of God?
Well, he has an experience in college. He takes a class with a professor who sort of, it's called like Christian philosophy or something, where he had to kind of rethink everything. And one of the conclusions that he came to in that was that Jesus wasn't God, which is interesting. He sort of says Jesus is a good example, a metaphor, an inspiration, but not divine. That would be silly, he says. So that leaves him with a pretty abstract view of God. God is something to him like order and rules. God is like the morality built into the universe. And not really something personal that can have a personal relationship with you. Except maybe in the sense of judging. He always has this intense sense that there is a great judge and he is afraid of being judged, which doesn't seem like a crazy fear to me. I also don't like to be judged. But he's afraid of being judged by voters, by political leaders, by newsmen and elites in Washington, D.C. He gets called Tricky Dick all of his life, and cartoons portraying him as someone who's like crawling out of the sewers, and he feels quite judged. And then also by religious leaders. He, as I read about, he starts a church in the White House and organizes church in the White House and spends more time organizing church services than any president ever. And part of what's going on there, and he explicitly says this, and several of the ministers say this as well, part of what's going on there is that he's afraid of being judged. The idea of going into church and having some pastor see the president sit in a pew and think, oh, I gotta say something to the president. I gotta reword this thing in my sermon so that I speak on the most relevant issue, and I'm going to stick it to him, and I'm going to be seen by my congregation being kind of prophetic or something like that. That terrifies him. So he sets it up where people will only ever be cautious around him, or only ever say, spiritual banalities. And I think that that speaks, though, to his idea of God, that on the one hand, it's this abstraction. It's just the order of the universe. It's just doing right. It's sort of moral law. But on the other hand, it's almost like Martin Luther talks about the law as the thing that judges you, right? The thing that makes you think you need something and you're not enough and you can't just be righteous just because you're walking around. But of course, Martin Luther's answer is, and that's why you need Jesus, and that's why you need grace, and that's why you need to accept this other part of God, which is not only judgment, but grace. And that's not the way Nixon chooses to go. For him, it's work and judgment and trying to earn being good enough.
So do you think politics was his way of salvation in his mind?
Yeah. It could have been something else. I don't think it had to be politics. He was interested in politics for other reasons, as so many of us are. I'm also interested in politics. But there was something about the way that electoral politics in particular involves seeking out approval that spoke to him pretty deeply. And that, he tried getting out of it a couple of times and it kind of never worked for him, and he would just be sad, basically. So when he loses in 1960, he moves back to California and joins a local law firm, and he's just depressed. He gets so sad driving home, he kind of forgets where he's going and just drives, and it just doesn't reassure him. It doesn't feel meaningful. It doesn't feel affirming. And then of course he runs again for governor, loses quite dramatically. And at that point, his family sort of convinces him, we're done. This isn't worth it. Why are we doing this? This is so sort of hard and humiliating, and you can do many things. And he, biographers often talk about this as his wilderness years. He moves to New York City and joins a big law firm, and it's kind of fancy. And one of his biggest contracts at that time is getting Pepsi the legal stuff they need to sell Pepsi in Japan. So that's the kind of stuff he's doing. But he just misses it. He misses the politics. He feels like a failure. He feels like a loser. And kind of the only way he cannot feel like a loser is in that arena of political contests. Okay.
So this summer is the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's resignation. So great timing on the release of your book. So would some of the same deeds, those same deeds that he did, cause a president to resign now?
No. So it's not even clear that it would have caused another president besides Nixon at the time. So I mean, just to review, because it was 50 years ago, it may not be fresh in everybody's mind. He, there are men who work for him in his campaign who do a number of criminal acts, specifically breaking and entering into the Democratic Party headquarters, which are at the Watergate office complex, which is why it's called the Watergate scandal. And they bug phones, right? That's the core. They actually did a bunch of other stuff too, but that's what they get caught for. And that's the core thing. And then, we know today that he didn't directly order that activity. He kind of generically ordered that activity. There's a memo that I found in the archives where he says, somebody should really do something about that guy who has an office in the Democratic Party headquarters. And then the memo is sent to someone who hires someone who breaks into the Watergate. So, but he doesn't say go break the law, so it's not quite a smoking gun in the way that you might have imagined. But what he does do that's clearly criminal and is cover up. And this is where we get the saying, it's not the crime, but the cover up. And he authorizes the paying of bribes. He suggests that witnesses be instructed to lie under oath. He tries to pressure both the FBI and then the CIA to he tries to pressure the FBI not to investigate a crime, and then tries to pressure the CIA to pressure the FBI to not investigate a crime. So all of that, simply put, is obstruction of justice and bribes. But he probably could have got away with it if he hadn't been recording himself. So it was actually the bugs that Nixon had placed in his own office that produced all of the evidence that brought him down. So, Lyndon Johnson, the president before him, did some stuff. We know that he did some stuff, but he didn't record everything. So some of it you don't have the evidence. So even if Johnson or Kennedy or another president back in those days had done exactly what Nixon did, it's not clear that it would have brought them down. This other element had to be necessary, the self-recording. And then today, definitely post Watergate, presidents are kind of allergic to having recording devices on all the time. Like they've learned that's a potential for a mess. And then, this Supreme Court ruling that came down earlier this summer about Donald Trump and potential immunity and immunity from criminal prosecution in particular it made this distinction that we've never had before. The Supreme Court made this distinction between like official acts that are criminal and unofficial acts. So like if the president shoots you, but it's an official act, it's somehow he's not open to prosecution. But if he shoots you on his personal basis, which it's not like the president has on duty and off duty hours. So like, I don't know. I find it a little bit legally confusing, which I guess I'm not the only one. But at least if you take that Supreme Court ruling and apply it back to Watergate, the paying of bribes probably would still be illegal and prosecutable, but like pressuring the FBI not to investigate is kind of an official act. It's a misuse of the official act, but it is part of the president's responsibility to talk to the investigative agency that's embedded in the administration, right? As part of his administration. So suddenly that parts of obstruction of justice would like not be criminal, I guess. Question mark, according to the Supreme Court, not according to my reading of the law, but I'm not a lawyer. But it is a particular moment, and I think it's at the time it was perceived as like a test of democracy. Does it really work? Can the top people be held accountable? And people knew there'd been lots of bad presidents and lots of presidents who'd done terrible stuff. And so that was sort of the unique humiliation of Richard Nixon, is he's the only one out of all of the scoundrels who've been through 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he's the only one who was forced to pay this price. And he was forced to pay this price in part because he recorded himself. And he recorded himself in part because he was worried about being judged and needed a kind of measure that he thought he could control of the true record that only he could say what had and hadn't happened and whether he was or wasn't guilty. That was a very long
do you
answer.
think, at least in part, he chose to resign because of his sense of shame, or was he resigning to spare him the shame of the impeachment vote?
Oh, I think both. Yeah, he definitely feels shame and kind of collapses under the shame. That's definitely the vibe, the sense that you get, but also like, oh, it was going to get worse. And for as long as he felt like he could hold out, he did kind of keep fighting. And, he let all the men under him take the fall if that would work. And it wasn't until other Republican leaders in the Senate sort of started meeting with him, and a group of them got together. Some very conservative Republicans got together with him and just said, like, you're not going to survive the vote. If by the time it gets to us, like, we can't defend you. We don't have the numbers. Maybe none of us will defend you, but we definitely aren't all going to defend you, which is the other really significant shift. At the time, most districts and most voting districts in Congress were toss-ups. they could sometimes elect a Republican and they could sometimes elect a Democrat. There was a lot more sort of balance. And what's happened since then is a kind of, we talk a lot about polarization, but we've also had this thing called the big shift, where people who vote Democrat have started living more and more in some places, and people who vote Republican are more and more in other places, which means that most congressional districts go by a landslide. So a Republican doesn't have to worry about Democratic voters at all. He only has to worry about more conservative Republicans, and the same is true on the Democratic side, which has made it less likely. There were a bunch of Republicans who sort of stood up to a Republican president and said, like, you actually need to resign. We're not gonna protect you here. And I think unfortunately the ground has shifted, and that's harder to imagine that happening today.
Almost impossible to imagine it happening today.
I mean, maybe if you conjure a lot of hope, you can imagine it, but it seems pretty unlikely.
All right. Again, today my guest is Daniel Silliman, and we're talking about his new book, One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation. And when I was reading the book, two things really jumped out and captured my attention. Yeah. Two things in particular. The first thing was his courtship with Pat, his future wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He seemed to be so smitten with her that even after she rejected him, he was still willing to do things like drive her on dates with other guys.
Yeah.
That's unusual. We'll just say.
It's wild. Yeah.
And the second part, the chapter entitled 1968 also blew me away. So his relationship with black voters and why he initially decided not to attend Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral left me feeling a certain mixture of anger and sadness. So was there a through line with Nixon on racial issues that actually started in 1960 with JFK and carried him through his Southern strategy game plan?
Yeah, I mean, so there's been lots written about Richard Nixon as the kind of architect or first president to pursue the Southern strategy, which was, as you know, and maybe your listeners do too, was this effort of Republicans to recruit white Southerners to vote for them. And Republicans went sort of strong against civil rights as a way of recruiting white Democratic voters who'd been Democratic ever since Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And maybe that was the big reason for their party choice, was that they were Southerners and didn't like Abraham Lincoln. And they broke the Democratic hold on the South and also rejected civil rights and any concern for the equality of African Americans. And that's part of the major part of the story of conservative politics and Republicans in the 20th century, is them sort of making this choice that they make with Richard Nixon. What shocked me getting into it and looking was that Nixon had been on the other side. I think that part of the story was really missed. I didn't know, just as a sort of, before I got into this, just as a historian who cares about 20th century history, I hadn't realized that Nixon was the Republican champion of civil rights. So like in the Eisenhower administration, they put him out front and he pushed a civil rights bill in the Senate as a vice president, and worked with Martin Luther King Jr. quite closely to put that bill through. And sometimes, the civil rights that he was pushing were not as sweeping or as bold as the civil rights proposals that Democrats would push, but then the Democrats wouldn't actually get them through. So he had this sort of argument that he was making at the time, including to like the NAACP and Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, of like, look, I know that this is not everything, but we're actually serious. And on the other hand, the Democrats will hold up this amazing idea, but then they also have all of these racists in the South, and they're going to make them happy when the time comes. So they're like kind of selling you on a pack of lies. I'm telling you less than you want, but you can believe me. And that was kind of the deal. So, the civil rights bill that Nixon pushes in 1957 doesn't give the federal government power over jury trials. Like, he gets gutted a little bit, and so all white juries in the South are still going to be a thing, and that's going to make it, really hard to prosecute, basically impossible to prosecute crimes against Black people, including like Ku Klux Klan lynchings and attacks on people registering Black people to vote and this type of thing. That move to gut the bill, by the way, happens with Lyndon Johnson, who's wildly celebrated these days for what he does for civil rights later in 1968. But in 1957, he's the guy that makes sure that civil rights can't happen. And Nixon persists, and and Black civil rights leaders sort of debate about whether they're going to keep supporting this bill without the jury provision. And Martin Luther King Jr., who at that point is quite young, he's still sort of at the very beginning of his civil rights career, decides to continue supporting it. And so he and Nixon are on the same side. And I found several instances where they, not only met and talked and corresponded, but they actually spoke several times on the stage together and are both talking about civil rights in the same terms, right? King is saying, hey, this isn't just politics. This is a moral issue. This is a great moral issue of our day. This is not just about power. It's about like who is America and treating each other fairly and, stuff that people are very familiar with from King. But Nixon adopts that same language. Nixon's totally on that same, this is a moral issue. We got to get this done, They're not identical. He's still a Republican. He's still a political conservative. But in that point, he's sort of embracing the moral argument for civil rights. But then he loses in 1960, and he is specifically mad at Black voters. He's specifically mad at Black voters because of this one instance. Martin Luther King gets arrested for something silly like, I forget. I think it was a violation of parole. It was something that was like, that's not real, man. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think it was a sit-in at a lunch counter.
Yeah, he's arrested at a sit-in, and then they, but it's not that they get him for. It's a violation of parole because of the sit-in. And then this racist judge in Georgia sends him to a work camp, sends him to like hard time, and it's this. Everybody else in that sit-in was kind of let go in a day or 2 days and given a ticket, essentially. And clearly the judge, everyone sort of recognizes that the judge is trying to make an example of King, trying to punish King, trying to essentially stop him from having anything as civil rights by locking him away on this work farm. And King's people and other Black leaders reach out to Nixon to try and get him to intervene. He's running for president, like say something, call this judge, make it an issue, like pick this up and do something. And the most fascinating one is Jackie Robinson, who's actually a Nixon supporter, meets with him in a hotel room and like begs him to intervene. And Nixon refuses. And Nixon refuses enough that Robinson leaves the hotel room like weeping, and just like so frustrated he can't convince this Republican presidential candidate to actually take a stand. From Nixon's point of view, to intervene would have been demagoguery, right? The president doesn't control a state judge. The president shouldn't be an authoritarian. This would be seen as sort of nakedly political and overstepping, and like it's inappropriate. That's not how the system works, and we trust the system, and there should be a court of appeals. This is very sort of like technical approach. Like he's not really seeing this is a miscarriage of justice. This isn't just like a minor bureaucratic issue. But he refuses, and he won't do it. The Kennedys don't have any of those qualms, and they just go for it. So Robert Kennedy gets the judge's number, calls him at home, and berates him. There, of course, the judge is a Democrat. He promises to personally destroy this judge's political career. And so the judge lets King out. The judge is essentially bullied into doing the right thing by the Kennedy family. And because of that, several people, including Martin Luther King Sr., the father, overtly endorses the Kennedys, and the Kennedys print that up on a flyer and deliver it at every black church in the country the next Sunday. It's an immediate plan. So it's very clear that they're doing this for political purposes. It's very clear that they kind of don't care about the brokenness of the system. They're not trying to work through the system, So from Nixon's point of view, this is kind of horrible. But from black voters' point of view, this is someone we can trust. And so black voters mostly vote Democrat. And that hadn't always been true. It'd been leaning that way already, but really in 1960, there becomes this sort of deepened, cemented relationship between black voters and the Democratic Party. They're the party that does care about these things for us. And Nixon is so mad. Nixon feels so betrayed. And I was back there fighting for the Civil Rights Bill, which was legal and was a big deal. And you guys turned your back on me. He never says this explicitly, but you can kind of see it in his analysis of the thing. You betrayed me and you'll never be happy. And because of that, he just decides he's done reaching out to black voters. He's done sort of trying to do the right thing. So he looks at the lay of the land in 1968 when he runs again, and black voters are very happy with Democrats and strongly allied with Democrats. Of course, at this point, Johnson has passed a much larger civil rights bill than Nixon got passed in 1957. And so trying to win those voters is not a good strategy. And he goes the other direction. I argue in the book, he literally switches sides and he courts Strom Thurmond, an overtly pro-segregationist, very not subtly racist. A lot of people in American history are subtly racist, and there are other people who announce it publicly that's what they believe. And he goes after those people, right, and tries to win their support and win their vote, and he does. And that's a key reason that he wins in 1968. But from a religious narrative perspective, that's really interesting politically, and that's really important in terms of the racial history of this country. But from a religious perspective, from a religious biography perspective, it's also a man being on the right side of an issue, knowing it's a moral issue, talking about it as the most important moral issue of his day, and then realizing, but I can't win. I can't win and be right. And so I'm going to switch sides. I'm going to take the immoral side, the unethical side, because it means I get to be a winner. And Nixon pretty, of course we all have ways of justifying things to ourselves, but he pretty clearly chooses to be on the immoral side if it means he gets to be in the White House.
Well, and it's even more striking to me because of his Quaker background, which specifically had very strong views on racial equality, even during slavery times. So he went not only against his own convictions, but he went against those within his tradition that even if he wasn't firmly within that foundation, in every way, he violated his own conscience, seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, that anti-racist history of Quakers was less pronounced in California, where he grew up, and where the rules around segregation were a little different than they were in other parts of the country. But yeah, he understood that was the Quaker testimony, and the Quakers being, the first white religious group that's opposed to slavery and makes an issue of it was, a proud part of the heritage that he throws overboard. And of course, you see a similar thing happening in Vietnam. He's from this peace tradition that believes that a core testimony of their following Jesus is to be peacekeepers and peacemakers, and people who turn the other cheek. And yet he convinces himself that he's maybe the greatest peacemaker in the 20th century because he's willing to fight the war harder than anybody else and drop bombs in places that, it's actually a war crime to drop bombs. So I think, I hope that people read this and are appalled at what he does and the decisions that he makes. And I also hope that we recognize the deep capacity for self-justification, the lengths that humans will go to find a way to explain why the thing that they're doing is okay. So you even have there's even a moment in the 1968 chapter where Nixon decides that he can't go to Martin Luther King's funeral, where he gives some justification of obviously King would agree with me. King would understand why I don't support civil rights anymore because he was a reasonable one and not like these other radicals who are still around. It's that's crazy. But of course he's convincing himself.
Yeah, his capacity for rationalization I found to be superhuman in reading your book. One story that another story caught my attention was when he was at Duke Law School, and he said they don't have any racial problems, basically because they didn't have any racials there. so if you have a segregationist law school, you've got one race only. So in his mind, there were no racial problems there.
Yeah, kind of astounding. Yeah, he just would reflect back on it and be like, yeah, I saw, and when he's reaching out to the segregationists, he would say, oh, I spent a little time in the South. I understand the way things work and it's all good. And, I went to law school at Duke and I got a firsthand look and we didn't have any racial problems. It's only, anti-segregation movements that have sparked these problems. And it's like, well, of course there weren't any racial problems. You didn't let anybody, there was laws restricting people. And, and I point out in the book, he kind of bought in at that point to this idea that segregation is just natural. It's a cultural sort of timeless way of life, and maybe humans incline this way anyway, but it's definitely, even if that's not true, it's definitely sort of just the culture of the South. Except he's a law student. He should be able to notice that actually this is a legal and political project, and there are new laws being instituted all the time to make segregation real. Segregation didn't just happen. It was instituted by law after law and politician after politician who made it, embraced white supremacy, sometimes overtly announcing we're doing this on behalf of white supremacy, not being exactly subtle. And, I guess I have more sympathy for the farmer who thinks that this is just the way things are, or the housewife who thinks those people are over there and we're over here and we have different cultures and this is just nature or just our culture. I think that's wrong, but I can understand how you can come to that position. But Nixon was interested in politics and interested in law, and those were the two spaces where that project was happening, and he just kind of chose to look the other way. And I hope that can, as I was writing, and I definitely found myself being convicted, oh, wait, am I sometimes choosing to look the other way? Am I sometimes he's a smart guy. If he can do it, I can too. And so I hope that it's a history book. It's not a moral Jeremiad, and yet there are some lessons there for those who have ears to hear.
Absolutely. So as we wind down this conversation, I just have one more question for you. So what do you think Nixon's ultimate personal and political legacy is?
I mean, it's a legacy of someone who destroyed himself. Ultimately, it's someone who was humiliated, someone who was thoroughly defeated. Kissinger, again, calls it a fate of biblical proportions. And he notices how sort of everything that Nixon wanted, he gets the opposite, right? He's a private person. He's exposed in the most public way. He wants to be seen as strong. He is exposed as incredibly weak. He wants to be seen as respectable. He's shown to be it's just a tragedy in the most classic sense of that kind of ultimate reversal. And I think, he's someone like many of us and like many politicians who spent all this time fighting other people and worrying about what his enemies were doing and dwelling and brooding and planning and plotting about his enemies. And in that, he failed to really reckon with the fact that he was his own worst enemy. And he brought himself down. He bugged himself, but he also made decisions about the people to have around him and how much he cared about the law and how, he was going to respond to both real losses and potential losses in his life. And I think that the sort of ultimate lesson there is, what profit a man if he beat everybody else and then defeats himself? You got to do that work of receiving that grace and feeling that love. Otherwise, it's going to have a lot of harm. It's going to have a lot of harm in the world. You're going to break a lot of stuff around you, and you're also going to defeat yourself. That's what happened to Richard Nixon.
It's interesting that maybe the ultimate lesson of this book is be a good parent. As simple as that. Tell your kids you love them and show them.
I think that's right. I mean, yes, parenthood is so important. I think the other lesson of it is, hey, if you don't have a good parent, you're going to need to work on that, man. You can't just kind of ignore the fact that your parents didn't care for you in the way that maybe they should have. And there are ways to forgive them for that too. You don't have to hate them or something, but you can't just kind of pretend it didn't happen. You need to deal with that stuff in your life.
Absolutely.
And if you can then turn around and give love and reassurance to your children and convince them that it's wonderful that they exist and that God also loves them, that would be great. And all of us would greatly benefit from more parenting like that.
Absolutely. So our guest this week has been author Daniel Silliman, and his book again is One Lost Soul: Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation. Daniel, thank you for being here today and sharing your stories. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey, it's been wonderful to be here. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.